This video is brought to you by the Logitech Lightspeed Wireless range of keyboards, mice and headsets, the benchmark in wireless gaming performance.
Spanning 3 generations of PlayStation consoles, having been announced first for PlayStation 3, finally appearing on PlayStation 4 in a rebooted form, and now arriving on PlayStation 5, Nioh is here, again, in remastered form. This is Nioh 1 and 2, remastered for PlayStation 5. I've spent a couple days here playing around with it, getting to grips with what this new version of the game offers, and we have all of that coming up today. But to discuss it, I wanted to bring on someone else who has also played some Nioh, at least the second game, and that would be Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, John, happy to be here and talk about Nioh 2, a game that I really liked, actually.
Yes, it's a punishingly difficult game, but very addictive and enjoyable. So I guess the main thing here to lay out is that Nioh 1 and 2 technically have some significant differences between the two. It was a noticeable upgrade, even on PlayStation 4, and that does apply here. So we're going to be talking about basically all 3 modes for each of the 2 games today, stacking it up against the PlayStation 4 originals, and then I'll kind of share my thoughts on which modes are best to use for this game, because it does differ somewhat between the games and of course the hardware you're using. So Alex, should we start with Nioh 1?
Yeah, let's do that. Basically with each game here and with Nioh 1, of course, you have the ability to select 3 modes. A 4K mode, targeting that resolution, a boosted quality mode, which will increase visual aspects of the game, perhaps at the cost of resolution, and then a 120 Hz mode, which will decrease both resolution and some of the in-game quality, but going for that blazing fast 120 FPS frame rate. Looking into Nioh 1 here, going into the 4K mode that you looked at here, John, that we've been talking about before we started recording this video, it looks to lock at native 4K, but in some moments you recorded, it looks like there's drops possible, right? Down from 4K?
Yeah, so it is possible, but by and large, Nioh 1 does actually seem to stick to 4K resolution very much most of the time, which is key. But beyond that, it's true 4K here. So if we compare it to the PS4 Pro, for instance, that version uses checkerboard 4K, and it was never an especially great checkerboard implementation. So all of the issues like the double width transparency and all the extra aliasing and artifacts you would get from it have been eliminated, producing a much cleaner looking game in the process.
Yeah, I wasn't a great fan of that checkerboarding in Nioh 1 or in Nioh 2 for that matter. So that's nice to see that it's not in use here for that 4K mode.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now the other mode then, it's more like the default PS5 mode. I call it the quality mode though, because that's what it offers in terms of visual detail. And that's kind of the main thing. Basically, this one also kind of aims for a high resolution 4K image, but I counted plenty of moments where it would drop to like the 1800p range or so, and presumably it can go even lower than that. So it's basically a more dynamic resolution that you can expect here. But on the flip side, this mode gives you increased distance detail, so things like plants, rock formations, etc. are drawn out further into the distance. And it's not just like LOD switching here. This is a case of where as you're running through, you'll actually see things pop into existence in the 4K mode that are more visible across the map when using the quality mode.
I guess one little thing to drop in there before we go on to the next 120 Hz mode is that John's saying it can possibly dip lower than 1800p. One thing to get across about Nioh that I also had when I was making my video of the second game is that it's pretty hard to get really far into this game and against every boss, because the game is rather challenging and you have to do it across at least, multiple modes with multiple consoles maybe if we're...
They don't make it easy either, because you can't switch in real time. You have to load out to the main menu and jump back into the game.
Yeah.
And that actually highlights something I want to quickly mention here as an aside. The game has a couple of little bugs in it that I encountered when switching modes back and forth. Specifically this. If you look at the cloud formation here, they appear to be rendered as sort of this like square pattern. Basically the textures for the clouds appear to have been corrupted, and then it even carries over to the main menu if you jump back in there. It's fixable by simply rebooting the game, and it only seemed to occur when switching graphics modes, but it is a weird thing.
Bit of Minecraft looking clouds there, but as you mentioned, small bug, goes away. But how about that 120 hertz, 120 FPS mode? How's that looking there, John?
So this one's tough because obviously I can't capture the 4K 120 output of the PS5 console because that's HDMI 2.1. So I can only capture 1080p. But looking at the pixel structure, I'd say it's probably 1080p or slightly above. Again, I can't say for sure.
Yeah.
But it does seem to kind of stick around there. So you definitely lose image quality as you would expect for 120 hertz as it is heavier.
How's the rest of the presentation next to the resolution, like shadows and stuff?
For Nioh 1, it's actually very comparable to the 4K mode. Almost identical, in fact. It's really just a loss in resolution in this game.
Yeah.
So it looks good. And also, I should note, if you bring again the PS4 version again, there are some extra details there, like on this beach again. If you note the ground detail, it actually receives sort of like a boost in actual like geometry.
That's awesome.
It almost looks like a palm or something, but I think it's more like they just adjusted the ground mesh. Though it's flatter on the PS4, you get extra detail on PS5. There's little things like that throughout, so it looks good. Then let us continue on to Nioh 2 for sort of the basics, and this one is a little bit more curious in how the changes stack up. So first of all, starting again with the native 4K mode, the first thing I noticed here is that it does not stick to native 4K. In fact, you can spot it dropping fairly often. Like, I actually have this point right here by the gate, right at the beginning of the game. If you sort of look up and then down and then up again, just kind of move the camera, you can actually see it popping between native 4K and then what looks like 1944p or so. The resolution stays pretty high, but it does drop.
If I recall correctly, Nioh 2 doesn't use like a very heavy like accumulation temporal anti-aliasing or something like that. So
no, nothing like that.
Changes between resolution in dynamic res, well, in the moment of combat won't be completely obvious. They're definitely more obvious to our eyes when we're looking for pixel counting, for example, or something like that. To a degree, as you were mentioning, there's motion blur added in Nioh 2, which is one of the reasons why the game is possibly heavier than Nioh 1, among, I would say like better effects work and things like that, but it's not always completely easy to count Nioh 2 in spite of all that.
Yes, this is true. All those extra effects definitely make it more difficult to get a fix on this, but you definitely will see it going up and down more often than the original. And it's kind of the same with the default or quality mode, which in this case, it doesn't really seem to hit 4K much at all. Usually it's around the 1944p, and then it seems like it can adjust from there. So you do lose some of the clarity. But I guess the biggest thing here is there is a visual difference between the 4K and default modes, where you get extra detail at the distance, but also much improved shadows in the quality mode.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Though they're still not bad in 4K. But the problem with the way Nioh updates its shadow maps is that at a distance they sort of like update between states in like a very slow interval. So like as you're running through, you'll sort of see shadows kind of like popping very visibly just playing the game, and it can be pretty distracting.
Yeah. What a shame, but they're going for really high resolutions here. It does make a bit of sense based upon that.
But still, it looks much better than the PS4 Pro version. So
yeah,
which has that awful checkerboarding in the default or in the high res mode. So
yeah, and then also like the extremely low resolution of the non checkerboarded mode, the performance mode, which is basically 720p 1080p DRS. This is much higher res on PlayStation 5.
Exactly. And that also is true of the 120 hertz mode, which is our next thing to discuss. And this seems to be a similar kind of image quality to Nioh 1, but this is where I really noticed a drop in visual quality, especially with the shadows. But also some of the detail, like the shadow maps in this one area, for instance, if you just look at that, they're just turning, like after a certain cutoff distance, it just turns into this like nondescript blob. And it sort of flicks between different states depending on where you look. You also lose all sort of dynamism in the shadows. Like if you're in the quality mode, for instance, shadows from the trees, you can actually see sort of like leaves blowing within the shadow, where the shadows are completely static in the 120 mode. So they're lower res, they're completely static, and even things like this, like where I'm standing on the roof, you can see your shadow against the building here in the other modes, but not in the 120 mode. So that is gone.
You know, there's a lot to be said why something like this would happen. You know, pushing 120 FPS on like a complex Nioh 2 like level requires like the CPU to be doing quite a lot of work, and reducing some of that complexity, like with the shadows being more static. I don't think this is really probably completely GPU related stuff, but more like making sure there's enough CPU headroom at all the time, you know, because the game's, it's pretty dynamic when you get into combat, you know.
Yeah, definitely. And then the other thing is the actual like object pop-in distance. This is scaled down much further in the 120 mode versus either of the other modes, to the point where when I was setting up a comparison shot to look at the shadows here, I was using this little shrine in the middle of the yard in the other two modes, and I arrived there on the 120 side and it's just gone.
Yeah.
And this is true throughout. These objects are just like missing from a certain distance. Then if you run up closer, they'll kind of pop in. So there's basically a lot more pop in, and the shadows look really artifacty in Nioh 2 in the 120 mode. So compared to the first game, it's much less attractive in this mode.
Yeah, I guess, you know, like I said, it's that CPU headroom, and also the fact that Nioh 2 does use more GPU related effects than Nioh 1, you know, so it is going to be a heavier game, you know.
Okay, but there is some really good news as well if we move on to loading, which was the thing that impressed me the most. Okay, for reference, I'm just going to use the first game, but this applies to all of them. So on PS4 Pro, installed to my internal drive, I measured around 21 seconds to load into the first level. On PS5, though, it takes basically less than 2 seconds. It's so fast that it's almost as if you're just waiting for an animation to play to show the X button more than like actual loading. Like, it's basically instantaneous, which is really cool. So that makes both starting the game from a cold boot and also like reloading after death so fast that it just removes any frustration there. So that is amazing. But I also tested the original Nioh running on PS5. So this is the PS4 version on PS5. And I should mention, by the way, for visual quality, it actually holds like the higher resolution mode. Like the 2160 checkerboard mode, for instance, and the movie mode with unlocked frame rate, it just locks to that on PS5. That's awesome. And it's very smooth, very sharp, though it still has the PS4 limitations. But anyway, the loading, that's actually more around 8 seconds or so when installed on the SSD, and it takes upwards of 18 seconds when running from a USB drive.
That's interesting.
So this is a really interesting example of how the game is optimized to take advantage of the PS5's native APIs to improve loading versus just running in backwards compatibility mode.
That's a pretty big difference. That's, you know, more than like what, 400% essentially.
Yeah,
that's
it's
amazing.
Huge.
Yeah,
it's huge. So that right there is an absolute killer feature. So I guess before we get on to performance, let's just quickly look back over this just to understand why. We've said some things that are maybe sound a little down, but really, overall, most of the modes in both games look pretty good, and they're pretty solid. It's really only the 120 mode in Nioh 2 that looks a little bit reggy around the edges, but it's a massive upgrade over the PS4 original in all ways. It just looks better, it's much sharper, and the loading is much, much, much faster. So that's great news.
Yeah, that all sounds pretty good. But so how does the performance hold up, let's say, in Nioh 1 in the 4K and in the quality mode?
So, okay, there's going to be some pretty significant differences between Nioh 1 and 2. Because Nioh 1 is close to perfect, I would say.
Wow.
So both the quality and the standard modes pretty much lock to 60. Like 99% of the time on average. And again, I haven't had time to really dig into. I've played much further on PS4. I haven't had time to play through that much of the game on the PS5, sadly. So I'm pretty much basing this on the initial levels. But this level was also one of the heaviest in the original games anyway, so it's not unfair to say that it's very stable.
That's
so
not bad.
You will get some dips occasionally, almost kind of like I don't know, it could be just pulling in new data or just suddenly looking at a new area and maybe the DRS doesn't catch up. It's a weird thing to say there, but either way, it's
that sounds pretty great.
The same is true of the 120 hertz mode. And this is fantastic. This mode feels so good and so responsive. It's sharper than the performance mode on PS4 Pro, which is what you needed to play in to get 60 FPS, but it's double the frame rate. And in this case, it just feels so much more responsive and just perfect. Which is why I spent most of my time actually just playing in this mode, because it's just kind of the way to play the game. It's really good. And again, there are some hiccups here and there, but it's almost perfect. And that's pretty much what I could say about Nioh 1, is it just runs like a dream, as you would expect. It is ultimately, a last generation game with minimal visual upgrades, so you would expect fantastic performance.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, actually. And one thing I want to mention is that I've only played one 120 hertz game really on the PlayStation 5 so far, and that was Black Ops. And that required some weird going into the PlayStation 5's system submenus to get 120 hertz mode. But you do not need to do that in this game, correct?
That's correct. This works like
okay,
the patched version of Devil May Cry 5 does now.
That's good.
Where essentially when you switch to 120 mode and then you back out of the menu, it pops over to the 120 hertz output. And it only does that when you're in that mode. So
good.
It's very easy to use. There's no fiddling around in the system menu you need to do here. It just works. So that's great.
Now, how about that Nioh 2?
Okay, so this one, this one's okay. So the default quality mode is pretty good. It's mostly stable 60, a few dips here and there, but I felt that this was a great way to play the game. It's sharp, it's stable for the most part. It looks really nice. It's definitely a big boost over the PS4 version. Now, the 4K mode, which doesn't hold to 4K as often as the original game, that one is a lot less stable. Not necessarily like bad slowdown, but I got the impression that it was getting hung up on DRS changes. Like when it would suddenly you turn the camera around and a scene would be a little bit over budget, it feels like it would be delayed, so you'd get a small dip as it sort of adjusts the resolution there.
Yeah. This is something we've seen in a couple of games before. Like if you would look up at the sky really quickly and look down again, you'd see the DRS flipping too late and the frame rate dips. A little bit uncomfortable, yeah.
Yeah. So, in this sense, because it's not even usually always native 4K and the quality mode tends to look close enough, I kind of feel like in this game, it doesn't make sense to use the high-res mode.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't offer that much more. It actually kind of looks worse overall, and it has more stutters in the frame rate, so I don't recommend this one. But the 120 mode, this is the one. This one's interesting. So it still feels good, like Nioh 1, of course. But when you get in, just again, I haven't had a chance to play too far in this game, but this first village area, as soon as you arrive in this area, you immediately start to encounter dips. And now if you look at our graph here, it looks pretty bad. And that's because, it's still dropping like 20 to 30 frames at points in worst case, which is bad numbers wise. But the difference between 120 and 100 frames per second feels minimal compared to, say, 60 to 40, because the overall frame rate is still much higher. So it's not as bad as something like that. But you will definitely notice drops in a way that I kind of found it a little bit distracting in comparison to the original game.
Yeah, this is one of those areas where it's, just to keep talking about this issue, but, that the PlayStation 5 doesn't have VRR. This is that 100 to 120 FPS range is really, really good for VRR, even down to 90,
It's perfect, yeah. I mean, it would solve it entirely. But like I said in the Destruction All-Stars video, we're going to continue to raise this VRR point until it's patched into the PS5, which it sounds like it's coming at some point. But this is yet another example of how having that feature available would completely fix this problem. Because any TV that's doing 4K 120 output anyway is probably going to support VRR, so it feels like the perfect thing to include.
So if you were to look over Nioh 1 and Nioh 2, which modes would you recommend for which games?
Okay, so for Nioh 1, if you have a TV capable of 120 Hz, that's the mode I recommend, because it just feels so responsive. But if you prefer a little bit of extra clarity, then I would actually say the quality mode is the way to go, because it is generally around 4K, but you get a little bit of extra distant detail, and it's also very, very solid. So 120 goes first, followed by the default / quality mode. For Nioh 2, though, I would say that's the one where I would stick with the default / quality mode, the PS5 mode as they call it, whatever. This one runs the smoothest. It holds 60 FPS more than the others, and you get the best visuals with the least distracting artifacts. It's definitely the best mode in this game. Whereas the 120 mode, it does feel good a lot of the time, but the dips are kind of noticeable. And the sacrifices to visual quality, especially with the shadows, it's significant. So I don't recommend this one as much.
It would be interesting to look at what exactly is preventing the frame rate from being more stable in Nioh 2 in its 120 hertz mode, maybe with comparisons to PC at some point in time or something like that, because it is a little bit strange. I think that it would be, maybe it is just the DRS, like you mentioned, not stabilizing quickly, or maybe the environments are too complex to some degree. I'm not sure what it is. It's very interesting.
It is indeed. Another interesting thing is I mentioned the square clouds in Nioh 1, but Nioh 2 had its own glitch that also occurred when switching modes, usually between 120 and the 4K modes. It's this, where basically every so often, it seemed like maybe as the DRS was adjusting, you'd get a single frame flash that looked like this big white blast of nonsense in the screen. And it would just kind of flicker and flash as you turn the camera around. It's unplayable, and it's not nice looking. And again, restart the game and it fixes it, but I was a little bit surprised and disappointed to see bugs like that slip through. But at least it does seem to be limited to switching modes back and forth too often. So I guess if you kind of settle on the graphics mode that you want to use, it doesn't seem like it will be an issue. But still, it's weird.
Yeah, that is a bit weird. But all in all, sounds like a pretty awesome package here. I definitely would love to see Nioh 1 at 120 hertz like you're describing it. Sounds great.
Yeah, and it's also nice to know that the retail physical version of this game actually ships with each game complete with all DLC and all the updates, each on their own disc. So it's actually a 2-disc collection that you can buy. I really like this, and I think this is kind of the way forward for these kind of releases. I was really afraid they would either do like a download code or like you'd have partial download or just, but no, the whole thing is here, and that's excellent. So
yeah. Excellent for future preservation.
Yes. So yeah, that's pretty much Nioh on PS5. It's good. It's still a great game. I want to sit down and really play through it again because I never spent that much time with Nioh 2, but I played the heck out of the original, and it's still awesome today. And if you're looking for another Souls-like game that's perhaps has its own flavor and is also, I'd say, even more challenging in many ways.
Yeah, I'd say so too.
Mainly because it's less forgiving, I think. Like, if you make errors in this game, you're punished brutally.
Yes.
So it's very exciting in that way. But yes, that's going to do it for this one. So thanks for joining me, Alex.
Of course, John.
And if you guys enjoyed this, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, find the original file over on Patreon, all that good stuff. You can also find us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Alex signing off and saying,
Auf Wiedersehen.
A gaming icon evolved. Logitech's renowned G502 mouse joins the ranks of the world's most advanced gaming mice with the release of the G502 Lightspeed. Featuring ultra-fast wireless connectivity and reliability, with performance trusted in competition by esports pros. Featuring the next generation Hero 25K sensor and PowerPlay compatibility, this is the ultimate rendition of the celebrated G502 mouse.